Without much further ado, it is my pleasure and honor to welcome Mr. Ulrich Weigl. Mr. Weigl joins us today from the European Commission. He is heading the Bilateral Trade and Sustainable Development Unit in the European Commission's Directorate General for Trade. The unit is responsible for the negotiation and implementation of trade and sustainable development, TSD, commitments in bilateral trade and investment agreements. This includes policy development like the recent review of the implementation and enforcement of such TSD commitments. The unit is also responsible for the application and monitoring of the EU's Generalized Scheme of Preferences, GSP. With this, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and Natasha and Gucci, thank you so much for this very nice welcome. It's indeed a privilege and a very nice opportunity to talk to you as amfori organization and amfori members on this important topic. Now, based on where I'm coming from, I felt like adding that perspective of where do the free trade agreements and the sustainability commitments come in, and what do they add or what do they bring in addition to the legislation you have been looking at that's coming out of the European Union, might be another element that could inspire your reflection and your conversation. And indeed, the work we did to update the Commission's take, the EU's take on how do we propose and negotiate and how do we implement sustainability commitments in trade agreements has been also accompanied by significant input and reflections from your organization. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank you wholeheartedly to contributing to our work with your input. Now, when we look at trade and sustainable development chapters, we look at a body today of 11 trade agreements since the agreement with South Korea that includes trade and sustainable development chapters with broad and binding commitments on core labor rights, on multilateral environmental agreements, on the role of business and responsible business conduct, on cooperation, on key topics like climate change or deforestation. So broad agreements, important agreements that have become a key element of our negotiating agenda. But let's not forget, it also means we need to get agreements done, signed and ratified. So getting these agreements first in place will be a very important thing. I would like to look with you briefly at the outcome of that review and mainly zoom in on 2 or 3 key features of that, update you on what we're doing on the rollout, so what's going to happen on this end and how it may feature in your reflections. And then I look at a couple of upcoming issues that we have and open questions that we still have that might also benefit from your reflection input, because I may also say this just up front, your work, your engagement, your attention that you're putting on the role of business and human rights, or business and environment, is an important also source for us to identify what are the priority issues, what is it that we should be focusing on. So that kind of interaction and conversation that we should have will be an important thing on the way forward. Now, first, outcome of the review and the main features that we have there. The review was a promise that my Executive Vice President Valdis Dombrovskis made to the European Parliament in autumn 2020, saying we will bring forward reviewing how we negotiate, how we implement these commitments in trade agreements. To do this fact-based and in an inclusive way, we organized an open public consultation, which is where amfori also contributed actively and with a very inspiring contribution, with us how other jurisdictions negotiate, implement, enforce these commitments in their agreements. That is also been published beginning of this year. And in the end, we produced an outcome, a communication, so a formal document that commits the European Commission as an institution to take forward this work on trade and sustainable development in a certain way. The outcome is centered around 6 policy areas, 20 actions. I will not walk you through all of that because that would take a bit of time. The material is published, but zoom in on a couple of key features. And I think number one, very importantly, is that we want trade and sustainability firmly anchored in international standard setting. That clearly came out of the conversations we had before with stakeholders, with members in the European Parliament and member states, that we should forestall any attempts to kind of either get ahead of what's being negotiated multilaterally. It's not that in our bilateral agreements we can create additional or new commitment on the nationally determined contributions to the climate ambition. That's something that has to happen under the UNFCCC. And at the same time, we should not export what we think is good for the EU doing, because then we would impose things in a way that might risk making us having to pay in the negotiations for those outcomes. We are much better served by making the international standards a basis for our commitments. So we refer to the ILO system, mainly for the fundamental principles and rights. We have now 5. In June, occupational safety and health has been added. And we refer to the multilateral environmental agreements that both sides have ratified, including, very importantly, the UNFCCC framework and the Paris Agreement. So, number one of the main outcomes. The second important outcome is that we want to zoom in much more on country priorities. And that is a work that we can certainly do with the body of intelligence and information we do have, and that we get out of the ILO in that case, but also that we get out from non-governmental organizations, from the unions, but also from your work. And we have seen in your contribution in the work that you come across instances and situations where you discover that maybe somehow we should also get the other engaged and working on these issues from their side to get their compliance with these requirements up and improved. I take these opportunities also to point out the main difference here between what we have in EU legislation and what we can do with the trade agreements. Legislation addresses what's coming and arriving on the EU market. But with the bilateral engagement with trade agreements, we can make a contribution to engaging with the other countries and look at the situation on the ground there. There is a genuine element that adds, in addition, what the legislation brings. Now, the other 6 priorities, 3 priorities, 6, I covered on 2 elements, we want to look at sustainability not just as the commitments as such, but also look beyond at what is there in the trade agreements that could help us use trade proper to promote and project sustainability. One example would be the environmental goods and services list that we have in New Zealand. Now, we have heard suggestions to maybe also look at circular goods and services, one other area. The challenge we have here is to look at things that are products or services that have credible green credentials. So to distinguish what is real or what is maybe dual use and is not so clear. And that was, the New Zealand list for green goods and services gives you a first example of what it is that we can also use the trade agreements for. And maybe there are other ideas. Again, we're looking here at input and suggestions coming from the actors on the ground. There may be other ideas how we could use maybe non-tariff barriers, looking at non-tariff barriers, looking at procurement commitments, looking maybe also at the necessary business environment, like through intellectual property protection, to create an environment that facilitates the flow of goods and services to manage the transition that we all have to manage on climate in a way that's more affordable and more effective. So this is the third question. We would have to bring more together in collective monitoring of what we do, but also in collectively looking at what we can bring to the implementation of these commitments. And on our side, this would require not just a mapping of what are the priorities, but maybe also a mapping of the tools that are there. So what kind of money pots, projects are already dedicated to issues that we want to pursue on the labor side, on the environmental side? So first, to make it visible. Second, to connect it better across the Commission. We're looking here in particular at DG INTPA, but maybe also at projects that DG Environment is creating to accompany the legislation on deforestation. So these things need to be connected. And again, we would imagine, as we also have committed to discuss that outcome with civil society, certainly including business, that this information might be also helpful in your reflections on how you can go about and what you can draw on or refer to when adapting to the due diligence requirements that come out of our legislation. Now, finally, I should also say there is a big role for civil society, including business, that has the majority of our actions refers to that. 7 out of 20, so it's by proportion the biggest part. This will be important. We're counting on input, and I think we're looking forward to see you actively involved both formally in what we call the domestic advisory groups that accompany the implementation of trade agreements, and ad hoc as amfori, as members of amfori, when you come across things that you think we should be aware of and take up. I should say on the communication, the last word, we just had this week the adoption by the Council of Council conclusions, wholeheartedly welcoming the outcome of the review. And we had just 2 weeks ago a resolution by the European Parliament that did exactly the same. So we're now getting a lot of backwind. The backwind is very useful to have. The backwind is also important to have to inject new dynamic and new energy into getting the agreements that are there ratified. Chile and Mexico first and foremost. New Zealand is now there as well. To get more agreements negotiated according to the new standards, and to bring the implementation to the agreements that are there already. And that is, in a way, already a summary of what is the rollout. So the second point, we're now very active in bringing all of those commitments to reality. Number one is adding the new elements that are there in the implementation, but also in the text, adding those new elements to agreements that we negotiate. So we are now negotiating with India, with Australia. We will be taking up the thing pretty soon with other jurisdictions when they are ready, when we can engage. Indonesia is certainly in the waiting. Maybe Kenya is a fiver coming. And we have to bring to these ongoing negotiations the ambitions that we have as appropriate, as it fits the context. And there's one element I should also highlight, and that is we also have added sanctions. So a compliance phase and trade sanctions for core commitments to our future agreements. And that, as appropriate, will be also brought to ongoing negotiations. Now, I spoke about getting agreements ratified, bring that to negotiations, and of course we have those 11 agreements with 18 countries, where we have to bring the practice, the new ambition, to the actual implementation. amfori as an organization is present in 2 domestic advisory groups, on the UK and on Vietnam. So it's your direct input that will come to us, but also, as I said, on anything else. Now, let me look at a couple of upcoming issues that are still there and that will require more reflection, and where we count on your further input. There's the priority setting, so things that you see on the ground and that we want to share, and we've been very keen takers on anything you think we should be aware of and make part of our agenda in the conversation with the other countries. Or when we talk about the mapping and the funding, we heard, for example, from the unions that they have their own projects and money pots and things that they do. understanding where you see your focus for engagement might be another important element in connecting those different dots and making sure we're not redundant in what we try to do, but rather mutually supportive in our engagement with organizations on the other side, with the other government. And thirdly, there is this question of mainstreaming. So just repeat, we need to think collectively of what it is that we can do beyond the actual sustainability commitments in what trade agreements are good at doing in lowering tariff barriers, addressing non-tariff barriers, addressing the regulatory environment in so many areas to promote sustainability across the trade agreement. And there's a final point I haven't mentioned yet, and that is that interface between what trade agreements are doing and what we have in the legislation that is being prepared, that's coming out. Now, in terms of value added, trade agreements can reach beyond our borders. That's a plus. But in terms of interface, we have an open question in front of us. I think it's very clear there's one thing that trade agreements cannot do, not even the TSD chapters, and that is creating kind of green channel. So we have a trade agreement, and automatically it's very easy in complying with all the sustainability commitments. But this would seem particularly difficult for things that are hardwired and pretty strict, like the carbon border adjustment mechanism. It's very hard to see of what it is that trade agreements could contribute. There might be things that we could look at in addressing challenges in third countries to get towards compliance. But this is indeed an open question. We have no clear landscaping yet of what that might be and what it is that we could connect in terms of what the EU is doing already, what projects and initiatives are being taken on technical assistance, on capacity building, that could connect to very concrete and precise challenges that you face when organizing your due diligence with supplies and supply chains from other countries. So that's an open question that we have there, and that it could be part of our conversation as we move into the future. So if I may sum up, the work we have done on the sustainability review, trade and sustainable development review, should help us collectively, and that was the resonance we got in Parliament and Council, should help us collectively to get agreements to ratification and to get them into force, to inject dynamic into the negotiations that we are doing, so that we get these agreements in place as a basis for the economic ambition that we have, for the economic needs that we have, and even more so today in the current geopolitical context. We are rolling out the TSD review with a focus on negotiations, bringing the content to negotiations, but a focus also on the reality on the ground, priority setting and connecting the dots for a truly integrated, comprehensive approach to implementation. And there we're looking also at your organization and you as members of amfori to have a good conversation on what is the reality on the ground, what should we be focusing on, but also how can we connect the different things that are there in a way that is more productive. And we need to have more reflection and conversation on mainstreaming, and maybe at some stage when we see more clearly what exactly will be the outcome of the legislative process, whether and how we might be able to also see some links or connections between those. Thank you, everyone, and thank you very much for your attention and this opportunity. And if there are questions, I think we have still a little bit of time for those questions.
Yes, I do believe we have some time for questions, and we have someone with the microphones passing by. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry. Hello, thank you for this very inspiring speech. My name is Bruno. I'm a sustainability manager at the Cotton Group, which is a B2B brand in Belgium. And we import most of our goods from Bangladesh, which is a country that I love and I appreciate. the support that EU is giving to the trade with Bangladesh. But we are struggling with our factories over there to get the workers paid correctly. They get 8,000 taka, which is 80 euro, not per day, not per week, per month. And this country is benefiting from the GSP, so no tax duties, no tax exemption. And I believe EU should be a little bit more strict with the respect of human rights before giving or allocating a tax exemption to one country, even if they need more import from Europe, Belgium, France, or any other country. So we cannot change this because factory says this is the government who is deciding from the wage, and I cannot change this. Even BGMEA, the manufacturer association, is really asking for the factories to respect the legal wage and not to change it. So we, as a brand, we cannot do anything. But I believe EU might be a solution for the future.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Do you want me to
Yes,
answer directly?
that's fine.
Very good. Now you asked me on our other leg, on sustainability, the generalized system of preferences, where we are doing two things. I mean, now we are focusing on getting the legislation replaced by a new piece of legislation to enter into force 1st of January 2024, so that the regime has a perspective beyond the end of the application of the current GSP regulation. The second big leg in our work is the monitoring of the commitments. It has two main focus areas. One is those countries who have committed to do more in order to get higher preferences, what we call GSP+. And we have those countries who are the major beneficiaries of the preferences that we offer in exchange for complying with core labor conventions, with environmental commitments. But in the case of GSP, we also look at human rights in a larger sense, and we look at good governance commitments. We cover here and we focus on those beneficiaries who benefit most, and that's Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Myanmar. So we have a very intense monitoring process. With Cambodia, it intensified even more after the Rana Plaza accident, and the focus on labor conditions in Bangladesh, in the textile sector in particular. The concrete outcome of that is a labor action plan that we negotiated in our conversations, but that in the end Bangladesh adopted as its own. This is what we're focusing on. Now, if there are concrete things like the situation that you describe, I think that's a data point that has to be brought to the conversation. Our colleagues are very keen to reach out to civil society actors, including the brands that are in the country, to hear these things and to hear of how we can bring the different elements together. So I'm very grateful for you to adding that to the conversation, or maybe my colleagues have already been able to hear that from your colleagues in the country, because we also have monitoring missions that directly go there to have that conversation with stakeholders and the government at the highest level.
Thank you. One last very quick question. Bernardo, please go ahead. Microphone, sorry. 2.
Thank you. Bernardo Cruza, El Corte Inglés, based in Spain. It's clear the EU has a fundamental role in paving the way for companies doing responsible business in many countries. I seize the opportunity that you mentioned 3 countries in your reply to the gentleman, but I missed the explanation concerning Myanmar, which is at the moment one of the pain points for sourcing. And, you know, after the coup d'etat last year, I think we would appreciate some clarity on what the EU is doing in Myanmar and what is the position that we as responsible companies should take. Because we are in a lot of uncertainty what is happening at the moment in the country. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you also for that very important question, because answering this question has been a difficult call also within and among the EU institutions, also within the Commission, among the EU constitutions, and one that has to do with what is it that we want to achieve and what actions lead to those goals. And we all remember that when we had the coup, the military coup, there were immediate calls of withdrawing trade preferences under the GSP. But we also had very clear voices coming out of the country saying, if you do that, you will have no effect because the military has very little stake in that sector. And the people you hit are those who are the most innocent. It's women and children working in those factories. So we do a lot of damage without achieving much. And that was why we were hesitating. Now that is the discussion as is now. This is a discussion that is being brought back all the time. So I cannot look into the crystal ball and tell you where would we stand in half a year, in a year's time. I would wish to. I think the basic data points are still as they are, at least seen from an administrative point of view between us and the External Action Service of the EU. Beyond that, we have no visibility either.
Thank you very much. A very difficult question, I know, but appreciate your answer. Thank you again, Mr. Weigl, and perhaps another round of applause. I was particularly pleased to hear your message, talking about the role amfori can play in not only getting this legislation through, participating in the advisory groups, but also in its implementation and supporting compliance. So this is something we take, and we'll be following up with you, definitely. Thank you.